Welcome to this video about the approaches and implementation of restoration, or how to restore degraded land. After watching this video, you should be able to recognize important types of interventions to facilitate recovery of degraded ecosystems, their role, and the conditions they apply to. You should also be aware of the main steps in planning, implementing, and monitoring of restoration projects. Restoration of degraded land involves simultaneous restoration of essential ecosystem processes and the recovery of biotic communities, especially the plant communities. Land that is eroded or degraded by overexploitation generally has unfertile soil and limited retention of water and nutrients. This means that the energy, nutrient, and water cycles are damaged or dysfunctional and productivity is low. Furthermore, the soil surface may be unstable due to soil erosion, which prevents plant establishment. When restoring degraded land, we try to facilitate the recovery of the nutrient and water cycles by improving the retention of nutrients and water within the ecosystem. We also need to halt accelerated erosion and stabilize the soil surface. There are a number of possible short-term solutions to improve growing conditions of degraded sites. For example, creating pits or other microcatchments to collect moisture and nutrients, and to increase roughness by adding obstructions on the ground like rocks, debris, organic mulches, or cover crops. Each situation requires a specific set of solutions to deal with challenges ranging from loss of vegetation cover, soil erosion and salinization, to contamination and slope instability. Long-term solutions, however, always involve the establishment of permanent vegetation cover, as plants provide energy to ecosystems through photosynthesis and stabilize the soil surface. The energy harnessed by plants also builds up organic carbon in the soil and improves its nutrient and water retention capacities. Furthermore, the plant communities also shape the animal communities of each ecosystem. Vegetation succession is therefore one of the main mechanisms of ecosystem restoration. To help you understand this concept, think of a land that has just appeared from under a glacier, which is happening a lot these days with climate change. First, the land has no life, but then plants start to come in. First, those that can tolerate harsh conditions. Those pioneering plants modify the environment, and thus with time other species of plants and animals can establish. We call this process succession, and in restoration we are essentially trying to mimic this process, speed it up, and direct so that the restored ecosystem fulfills the goals of the particular restoration project. The first restoration interventions on eroded land are often revegetation by seeding or planting, frequently associated with fertilizers and, where needed, water harvesting techniques. The safest approach to finding suitable plant material for revegetation is to look at the native plants in the area, as these are adapted to the local conditions and disturbance regimes. If local plants are not available, it is important to select plant material carefully, as there are many examples of exotic plant species used for revegetation that have become invasive and have caused serious damage to ecosystems and livelihoods. In such circumstances, it is important to use short-lived, non-persistent species that will be replaced during succession. Subsequent restoration interventions may include the introduction of key plant or animal species to facilitate ecosystem development. In some cases, repeated interventions may be needed to help the recovery of the system, but with time, self-repair within the ecosystem takes over, leading to the formation of self-sustaining ecosystems. The methods used for restoration interventions often come from agronomy, forestry, or grazing management, although they are applied to stimulate and guide ecological processes. In addition to technical interventions, socio-economic and policy instruments can be used to facilitate changes in land use practices leading to restoration. Before starting a restoration project, it is very important to have a good understanding of the site conditions and know what biophysical, socioeconomic, and cultural factors may impede or facilitate the system's natural recovery. As discussed in the last video, an ecosystem has crossed a threshold when a disturbance, for example, overgrazing or drought, exceeds the ecosystem's capacity for self-repair. To repair the system, we need to identify the active barriers and use appropriate interventions to overcome them. To give you an example, the loss of a key plant species, such as a main tree species, from a degraded area can be an important barrier to woodland recovery. The species' inability to recolonize the area could be due to several different barriers, such as a dispersal limitation, a biotic barrier, unfavorable conditions for seedling establishment and growth due to grazing or competition, also biotic barriers, or limited availability of nutrients and water or erosion, abiotic barriers. Dispersal limitation can be overcome by planting or seeding the species in question. The established plants can later act as seed sources for further colonization. Competition, for example, by an invasive species can be overcome by cutting, herbicides, or even managed grazing and trampling to knock back the competing species. Abiotic barriers associated with lack of resources and instability of the soil surface can be overcome by revegetation or other surface manipulations. I hope this will help you understand that identifying the barriers is a key to selecting the appropriate restoration interventions. Thresholds controlled by abiotic barriers generally require modification of the physical environment before recovery can occur. Ecosystems at stage 3 and 4 are more degraded and may need more interventions than if only biotic barriers are present. An abiotic barrier can, for example, be active erosion that hinders plant establishment and buildup of nutrients. This requires interventions to halt soil erosion at the onset of restoration efforts. Notice that recovery of slightly degraded land or land in stage 1 only requires improved management, which can, for example, be reduction in grazing pressure or grazing exclusion. Do you think the severity of land degradation influences the cost of improving the condition of the land? Did you come up with an answer? The answer is that the cost of restoration is directly related to the degradation of the system. The more degraded the system, the more costly it is to improve its condition. This demonstrates the importance of sustainable land management to prevent land degradation in the first place. We need to realize that restoration does not happen overnight. Restoration requires a long-term commitment and careful planning. Different stakeholders should be engaged in this process and need to be aware of the different opportunities, costs, and benefits offered by restoration alternatives. The people who are dependent on the ecosystem should have a key role in setting priorities. It should be a rule in the planning, implementation, and monitoring of restoration projects to engage all relevant sectors of society and disciplines, including the displaced and powerless. This fosters a wide ownership and support of the project and the selected solutions. To ensure success of restoration project, it is also important to consider all forms of historical and current information, including both scientific and local knowledge. Restoration planning includes the setting of realistic and meaningful goals and clear objectives that describe the desired future state of the ecosystem. The objectives and goals guide the selection of appropriate restoration interventions and provide benchmarks to measure the progress and outcomes of the project. As you saw earlier, identification of the barriers to natural recovery are important for selection of effective interventions. But the choice of objectives and interventions is also influenced by environmental conditions and socio-economic conditions, as well as the available resources. Monitoring protocols and evaluation of the project's outcomes allow for adaptive management, which should be included in all restoration projects. Can you now answer the question posed at the beginning of this video? You should know by now that we can increase the potential of successful restoration by good understanding of the site conditions and the barriers that impede the system's self-recovery. Clear goals and objectives that are agreed upon among the different stakeholders help us to choose the right interventions that speed up and direct the restoration towards our goals. Adaptive management that allows timely adjustments of plans and interventions if things do not go according to plan is also an essential component of successful restoration projects.